everyone, welcome to the BioBreakthroughs podcast. I'm your host, Jared Taylor. We have two very special guests today. I'll let each of them introduce themselves, but let's kick things off.
Perfect. My name is Rohit Nambisan. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Lokavant. Lokavant is a clinical trial intelligence company. We developed a platform to enable computational feasibility as well as leveraging different models and AI for conduct analysis in clinical trials. Before I founded Lokavant, I was in the clinical research space, the life sciences space, as well as the hospital and healthcare delivery space in various different lives. I've had a number of years at Novartis, a number of years at Roivant before launching Lokavant, and I'm a neuroscientist by training.
Hi, Christine Senn. I'm the Senior Vice President of Site Sponsor Innovation at Advarra. At Advarra, we have technology for sites and the CTMSs, technology for sponsors and CROs to help trials be more efficient, and also obviously a huge ethical review component and consulting. And before that, I spent 18 years on the site side, 2 at an academic medical center, and then 16 building up a site network that is now the beautiful Centricity Research. And I'm thrilled to be at Advarra and also was former chair of ACRP.
Sweet. Thank you both for those intros, and thanks for joining us here today. Unlike some of our guests, I've spoken with both of you in the past. Rohit, you've been a guest in the past. Christine and I, we did some content at Advarra's Ensemble event that they put together. Or is it Ensemble?
Ensemble, yeah.
Ensemble. All right. It was a really good event. It was in Phoenix, Arizona. Lots of great people. So we have we're all familiar with each other, which makes this even easier. For today's conversation, I'd love to kick things off. Rohit, we'll go to you in terms of. I would love to hear your thoughts on comparing today's trials to rare disease trials, and really given their operational complexity. And I guess kind of part 2 to that is how should that impact study feasibility?
Sure. So I think when we think of rare diseases, we think of trying to find a very small population of patients in a healthcare, in a global healthcare environment, right? So for lack of a better term, needles in a haystack. And so part of that is being able to identify the patient density, where they get care, et cetera, and then accessing those patients as participants on a clinical trial. And then, of course, as you move from the planning to the execution of a trial, making sure there's adherence and there's a lower site and participant burden to ensure that patients continue to adhere through the study, because each rare disease trial participant is such a large part of the overall participant pool in a rare disease study. And what we've seen over the last 2 decades is a movement across the industry to move to what I would call rarer indications. And so the movement has been, instead of trying to get therapeutics developers trying to get a small piece of a large pie like diabetes type 2, we're trying to get a much larger piece of a smaller pie. So for example, to extend that analogy, patients who are diabetes type 2 comorbid with chronic kidney disease and metformin naive. So filters upon filters upon filters. What ends up happening there is it's still quite a challenge to identify the density of those patient populations for the purposes of study planning and feasibility, identify where they are getting care, because it's hard to identify those patients similar to a rare disease participant in a trial. And then all the same constituent factors in relation to adherence, in relation to high quality data pertain to a rare indication such as I just mentioned. So I think that is the challenge we're seeing. I remember seeing this when I was at Novartis and the move to pathways-based medicine. We started to see some of these challenges in both the feasibility side of trials as well as in the conduct and, frankly, conduct to closeout of trials as well. And the second part of your question again, Jared, what does that mean for feasibility?
Yeah, how should that impact study feasibility?
Yeah, so I think it's no longer the provenance of only using the historical data assets you've leveraged in the past to drive a feasibility analysis. I think there's a number of challenges associated with that. For example, a lot of the sponsors we've worked with in the past, or even contract research organizations we work with in the past, have leveraged their historical relationships with sites and site networks. And I think that's coming from a very, very good place. For example, you need reliability. You need to know how long activation is going to take up. You need to know what systems they're being utilized at those sites. And you need to have those relationships to enable good research to be performed within budget, within scope, and within a tight timeline. I think the challenge we've seen sometimes is there's a few different aspects here. One is representation. We've seen the emergence of the Fedora legislation, and historically, most participants, at least in the US, historically have been 90% white Caucasian males. And so if we're actually going to start representing the disease demographics per the indications we're developing for, we need to open that up. And frankly, we have to go to sources of data, sources of healthcare data, sources of investigator networks, etc., that may not be representative of what we've done in the past. I think the second piece there is we're looking for these fairly niche populations of patients. It's not necessarily, if you just leverage historical clinical research data, a lot of the sponsors we work with, a lot of the contract research organizations we work with have not necessarily had experience in that indication in the past, because there hasn't been a lot of development of that indication in the past. So I think, again, we need to think outside the network of data sources, relationships we've had in the past, and think more broadly to unbias the assets we're leveraging to identify patient populations, to identify those investigators/physicians who are treating patients and potential participants of interest for a study, so that we actually can move expeditiously through the feasibility process, which can be quite laborious and time-consuming, and move to the point of accelerating research to get those therapies to patients in need.
And I want to give Christine a second too to comment on that. Thank you so much for that. Like, kind of taking that to the next. Your part is on the feasibility, Christine. I want you to comment on really, what are some of the top problems in the way of feasibility is conducted from the site perspective.
I love that Rohit and I are coming from such a different perspective, because I do see, especially in rare diseases, what a difference it can make in terms of feasibility and what you're looking for, and certainly the diversity of sites. The thing that I've been really seeing from the site side for many years is, and I see it from the project management side, is that sometimes trials, if not almost all the time, are rushing toward an early milestone. And that can be the feasibility process, where there's very little time spent. There's a lot of energy spent on feasibility, but very little time spent on it in the scope of the whole trial. And I think that leads to many problems. And I can go into those, but really what I want us to focus on is we really want to get to. We want to get to completing a clinical trial with the number of patients needed, with high quality patient data, and doing so on time. And I contend that it's pretty disastrous, honestly. I'm going to use that word. I think it's disastrous to rush the feasibility process and then expect to meet those end goals. There must be reasons we do that, but I think that that's a problem. So, for example, not really having relationships with the sites, not giving the sites the full protocol in advance of asking those questions. One of the things I've told people is, if you ask a feasibility questionnaire and get response about patient enrollment, but all you did was give them a 2-page summary, a 2-page summary of the protocol, the site really is just doing the best they can, but they can't do all of it. They can't really know until they see the full protocol, the IP manual, and all of that. And so without that, it really renders the feasibility questionnaire useless. And then if you add a protocol amendment within a few weeks after that, it's really useless. And I absolutely think we're hurting patient enrollment because of the way the feasibility process is done.
And I want to give you both a chance to comment on this next part, right? Rohit, we'll go back to you real quick, since it's been a few minutes away from you. I guess, how can we resolve the issues that exist today? And probably a lot of people are sick of these 2 letters, but I'm gonna say it, is AI in automation technology, like is that one of the keys to resolving a lot of the issues that still exist, or is it more of a cultural change? And I'll let you both comment on that, but we'll start with Rohit.
Sure. I think AI is a possible path forward, but I think the truth is that it really comes down to any type of analytic or AI or technological solution driving insights is as good as the inputs you put into it, right? And so I think if we are, I know I sound a little bit like a broken record here, but if we are just leveraging the same relation, the same information we did before, we shouldn't expect anything to change just because we're putting those two fancy letters together and saying AI. And I do think, frankly, I do think there's value in all different types of information. So I know a lot of folks in the space, at least in the technological side and the data side, kind of look down upon the feasibility surveys, et cetera. But there's a lot of especially Christine just mentioned the feasibility surveys and the types of information that are being requested and how they're being requested. I think it's true also in the feasibility survey process, as Christine said, if you provide little inputs, you're going to get outputs that are not going to be that great. And the same is true for any type of system, any type of socio-technical system, whether it's AI or a relationship between a pharmaceutical company, a contract research organization, and a site or site networks. So I think we can do a lot with AI as long as the inputs are reasonable. When I say reasonable, let's leverage the surveys that we've provided in the past. My perspective on that specifically is that actually provides a little bit more about investigator motivation rather than a quantitative signal on how many participants can be enrolled. That's just my proclivity. But there's other data assets that we can use, like real world data that we've seen leveraged to identify which types of specific patients are getting care with which investigators in which healthcare centers in which IDNs or hospital networks, right? That can be indicative of where we need to go to provide access to those potential participants through those physicians and investigators. And so if you can get much more broad with the swath of information that you're bringing in to a model that can predict the output of, for example, time to last patient in a study, then you can get much more, I'd say, unbiased. It's tough to say accurate because what oftentimes when I talk to people in the space and say, are you accurate? They provide a study in history and they say, we're going to provide you the inputs and the country selection, et cetera, predict the LPI with this. I say, okay, well, you want us to predict what you did in the past when 90% of enrollment has always been delayed. So is that the right approach, or should we actually be more prospective with our analysis, doing this side by side with a live study, leveraging a different approach with the data, with the predictive models we've generated, as well as, I'm going to use another strange acronym here, but Gen AI. We've been hearing a lot about that. It's not a chatbot. We're not leveraging chatbots for every part of the research. But for example, there's utility in Gen AI that can be leveraged for this use case. One of the use cases we've leveraged is, when we think about the rareness of indications to date, a lot of that rareness sits in the eligibility criteria. It sits in the inclusion and exclusion criteria. It's not just non-small cell lung, EGFR positive lung cancer, all right? You have all these additional inclusion and exclusion criteria that filter and further rarefy the population of patients you're looking to participate in the trial. Well, you can use large language models to process that information and then look at historical studies and say, what actual studies are like this, even though it's not exactly the same indication, what other similar studies have there been in history that we can pool together and say, this is actually not only within the same indication or condition, but this is also as close as possible to the eligibility criteria. And that further filters the patient population. You can generate predictive models off that subset of the data. So just to summarize, I think that AI can actually provide a lot of value, but we have to think about the inputs to those models and have to make them as representative as possible to really change behavior and change outcomes.
Thank you so much for those thoughts. Christine?
I think that AI, exactly that, for rare diseases, for oncology, where there's a lot of input that's quantifiable, is especially useful because the AI can read a radiograph film. Sorry, I'm not medical, but it could read x-rays, it can read biopsy results, it could look at a biopsy. So there's a lot that can be done there. What I saw on the side where it was more internal medicine, however, and this is not a diss on internal medicine, but just that it's not always quite as quantitative with as much data. So you could have lab results, but perhaps someone decided not to do a pulmonary function test, for example. And so the doctor is calling something asthma, and we do a PFT and it turns out to be COPD. So you could actually miss a lot of patients if you're just using AI to find the patient in some ways, depending on what it pulls from. It could also look at symptoms. It could go off of more prose than something else. So where I see technology being helpful, and this could be AI, but it doesn't probably have to be, would be holding site information as a database, so that it makes it easier for more sites to get in and share their information. Because databases in and of themselves could actually exclude new populations. If sponsors and CROs are relying on site databases to get their PIs, their investigators, which means to get their patients, you could be going from the same pool. And we really need a lot more diversity in those indications that hit the large population, where we're not looking for a very specific population. And I would like to see us be as inclusive as possible when it comes to those things like diabetes and hypothyroidism and common cardiac problems. So I see a lot of opportunity for AI to go very specific, and a lot of opportunity for different technology to make us more inclusive.
Well, I want to, by the way, thank you both for offering up your thoughts. And I know we talked about AI. We have to talk about it. It's going to be for a while now, right? It's going to be more common to mention AI on within any conversation than it is to not mention it at all. So I really appreciate you both sharing your thoughts here today and kind of going back and forth a little bit. But wishing you the best, the best of luck, both of you, and let's continue to stay in touch and have a pulse on what's happening.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks, Jared.